We are sitting here at the steps of the University of Freiburg, where Heidegger was professor in 1928. In 1927, Being and Time, his magnum opus, was published hurriedly, in spite of the fact that its virtual, incomprehensible 500 pages seems not like a hurried kind of project, and yet it was unfinished. 1928 also saw the beginning of the collapse of the Weimar Republic, in which there was stock exchange collapse, inflation ran at an unprecedented rate, and there was political controversy raging. A few years later, in 1932, the National Socialist Party was democratically elected to power, and in 1933 began to suspend all democratic institutions and procedures. Similarly, and contemporaneously, Heidegger in 1932 submitted himself as a candidate for the rectorship of the university here. And he also in 1933 suspended any kind of democratic procedures which had taken place at the university at the time. And in fact, in many of his lectures, he, for example, would say things like, the will of the German people is essential, and that will is bound by the total will of the Führer. There are innumerable speeches in which he mentioned the Führer as being what was once the Dasein, human being, essential human being, of philosophical life, became the Dasein of the German people, the Volk. A great deal of controversy has raged about this, about his particular political position and where he stood, not least in relation to his supposed anti-Semitism. Now, it's well known that his wife, Elfriede Petri, was a virulent anti-Semite. The question was he? There are a number of references which are anti-Semitic references in his letters, for example. But it's difficult to reconcile those, which in fact was part of cultural life at the time, but to reconcile those with, for example, his very close relationships with Jewish people. Most notably, the world-famous, now world-famous philosopher herself, Hannah Arendt, once a student, then a lover. Elizabeth Blockman, for example, another student and lover. His own particular assistant, Max Bloch, all of whom he supported. The question in his complicit acceptance of National Socialism, and in fact his being a member of the Nazi regime quite explicitly, seemed to entail at the time that he was also, not coincidentally, but necessarily anti-Semitic. And he began to institute a regime here at the university, being rector, of anti-democratic reforms, so that it was suggested that, and it was demanded legislatively, that any Jewish, for example, professors or teachers at the university had to be dismissed. He would have to have done this. Now, he didn't. And it would have been very difficult for him, given the fact that his assistant, Max Bloch himself, was Jewish, and he promoted him. Although his wife was, as I mentioned to you, virulently anti-Semitic, he could not have been construed as being such. That was part of it. That was his excuse. That was his self-presentation or self-image. So in spite of the support of the National Socialist regime, he seemed to have an ambiguous relationship towards legislation that was being passed, which was anti-Semitic. In a number of books, one by Hugo Ott, himself an academic here at the university, and another by a philosopher, Victor Farias, suggested that anti-Semitism and this militaristic authoritarianism which he presented were implicit in the kinds of works that he was writing, specifically Being in Time. So although Being in Time initially suggested that there was the human Dasein, the human being, if you like, one human being, which was the center of philosophical investigation, became in time Dasein as the German Volk, and that was the problem. So, to what extent you can reconcile the existential, individual focus of human being and extend that to the German Volk in general was then and continues to be problematic. He never regretted this. He never, at least not publicly. I know that he said once to his friend Petzet, who also was a professor here at the university, that he made a mess of things. Basically, that his support for the National Socialist regime cast into doubt, into very serious doubt, the legitimacy and authority of his own writings and undermined them, and hence his historical significance. So that is a serious doubt about Heidegger. To what extent he was actually complicit in his political affiliation with the National Socialist Party. That was and continues to be a problem. And the problem is essentially this: to what extent is his philosophy, or had his philosophy been, fundamentally authoritarian, even militaristic in nature? Because he did call for three things in the supposed reform of the university. In its anti-democratic reforms, he called for three things, as Plato did 3,000 years before him, as being the essential aspects of human academic life, which is to say, labor, war, and academic work or will. The notion of will, which has been predominant in German philosophy, for example with Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and then again with Heidegger, the notion of the will of the nation became predominant. And this will of the nation consisted, as he said himself, in the towering will, as he called it, of the Führer.